We all kind of think we know the story of Oliver Twist. The poor orphan boy, that famous line, "Please, sir, I want some more," maybe the jolly pickpockets from the movie musical. But the story that first shocked and honestly horrified 19th century London, that's a much darker, grittier, and way more fascinating tale than you might imagine. In fact, it was a book that really got under the skin of some of the most powerful people on the planet.
So who said this? This wasn't just some random book critic with a bone to pick. No, this was the Prime Minister of Great Britain complaining about the novel directly to Queen Victoria herself. He found the book so coarse, so raw, that he didn't even want it represented in fiction. His complaint perfectly captures the shockwave Oliver Twist sent through polite society.
So that's the big question we're going to tackle in this explainer. We're going to peel back the layers of history, literary scandal, and even Charles Dickens' own dark past to find out why this book, which we now see as a beloved classic, was once considered, well, a public menace.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We'll start by looking at that huge gap between our view and the Victorian one. Then we'll dig into Dickens' gritty realism, the constant threat of execution that hangs over the entire story, and the author's own childhood trauma. We'll even place the book right in the middle of a national panic about crime fiction before exploring a pretty profound theory about why we're so drawn to dark stories in the first place.
All right, first up, let's really get into the massive difference between how we see Oliver Twist today and how it landed back then. It's a wild case of a story's reputation being completely transformed over time.
And that contrast is, well, it's just night and day. On one hand, you have our modern view, the musical Oliver, a story we might show our kids. But for Victorians, this was a story crawling with pickpockets, prostitutes, and brutal murderers. It wasn't some cozy tale. It was a controversial expose that dragged the filthy reality of London's criminal underworld right into the fancy drawing rooms of the wealthy.
And don't think for a second this was an accident. Dickens himself said this was exactly his intention. In a later preface, he basically said, "Look, my goal was to show these characters in all their deformity." He wanted to shine a light on the truth, no matter how ugly it was. So the shock? Yeah, the shock was the whole point. So, how did he make it so shockingly real? Well, that brings us to our next section. Dickens wasn't just making up crime stories. He was trying to capture their authentic texture, moving way beyond the swashbuckling, romantic highwaymen you'd see in other books. One of his key tools was language. See, Dickens had worked as a reporter, so he did his homework. He stuffed the novel full of something called thieves' cant, the actual slang used by London's criminals. This wasn't some made-up fantasy language. This was the real deal, pulled from actual dictionaries of the flash language of the time.
Here's a perfect example spoken to the artful dodger. Cracksman for a housebreaker, old file for an old fraud. Using language like this gave the criminal scenes this unnerving authenticity that readers just had never seen before. It made Fagin's gang feel less like storybook villains and more like a genuine, real-world threat.
But it wasn't just the slang that felt real, it was the stakes. The world of Oliver Twist is a place where the gallows aren't some distant possibility, they are an ever-present, terrifying reality looming over everything. Okay, so during this period, England's justice system was known as the Bloody Code. Public hangings were a huge spectacle, drawing massive crowds, sometimes up to 100,000 people. And listen, you didn't have to be a murderer to end up there. In the 1820s, get this, 2/3 of all hangings were for property crimes, stealing, burglary. For Fagin's boys, getting caught didn't just mean prison, it could very well mean death. And this threat is just woven right into the fabric of the story. Throughout the whole novel, from the workhouse onward, characters are constantly predicting Oliver's fate with this one chilling phrase, "That boy will be hung." It's a constant, nagging reminder of the mortal danger he's in, which makes his survival feel all the more miraculous.
And this is where it gets really clever. This theme runs so deep, it's actually hidden in the hero's name. Oliver Twist. It's a grim pun. In the criminal slang of the time, to be twisted meant to be hanged. His very name predicts the terrible fate society has laid out for him. It's an unbelievably dark piece of wordplay, just hidden in plain sight.
So where did all this darkness come from? To understand that, you really have to look at the author himself. The fear and desperation you feel in Oliver Twist, that wasn't just imagined. It was drawn from Charles Dickens' own incredibly traumatic childhood. When Charles was just 12 years old, his father was thrown into debtor's prison.
The family was totally ruined. Young Charles was pulled out of school and sent to work in this squalid, rat-infested factory. It was this humiliating fall from grace right into London's underbelly. And that experience left him with a lifelong, gnawing fear of poverty, and the sense that he had just barely escaped a life of crime himself.
This quote from Dickens, man, it is just absolutely crucial. He saw himself in Oliver. He truly felt that, without some stroke of luck or divine intervention, he could have easily become a little robber, just another lost boy swallowed up by the city. So when he wrote about Oliver's terror and his vulnerability, he was drawing on a very real, very personal well of fear.
But Dickens's personal demons weren't the only storm swirling around Oliver Twist. The novel came out right in the middle of this huge public controversy about crime fiction itself, a genre that was becoming known as the Newgate novel.
Let's just trace how this whole thing exploded. So, as Oliver Twist is coming out, another novel, Jack Shepherd, becomes this cultural phenomenon. It totally romanticized a real-life thief, making him into a dashing anti-hero. Then a sensational murder happens. A valet named Courvoisier kills his master and, reportedly, claims the novel inspired him. This sparked a full-blown moral panic. Dickens himself actually went to Courvoisier's hanging and was just disgusted by the whole mob scene. In response, he wrote that famous 1841 preface, fiercely defending his realistic portrayal of criminals against the glamorous versions he thought were so dangerous.
So after defending his work against all these charges of sensationalism, Dickens was left with this really deep question. If these stories are so ugly and so horrifying, why are we so drawn to them? And his answer, well, it reveals the profound psychological depth of his thinking.
This is Dickens's big idea, the attraction of repulsion. He basically argued it's a force as fundamental to our human nature as gravity is to the universe. We can't help but be fascinated by the very things that disgust and repel us. You know that feeling, right? That morbid curiosity we have about crime, about punishment, about death itself. For Dickens, that wasn't some weird flaw. It was a fundamental law of who we are.